Hello everyone, I am Tishya Majumder and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on migration, curated under TMYS Review March 2022 in association with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. TMYS Review March 2022 under the current theme of migration, displacement and resettlement seeks to explore and understand the niceties of migration from the perspective of forced migration. We are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is identity crisis and identity reconstruction, an inevitable consequence of migration due to partition. Today we have with us Professor Aninditha Koshal, Professor Vinod Kadriya, Professor Anjali Injuti, and Professor Pippa Verde as our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Professor Aninditha Koshal is an associate professor of history in Diamond Harbour Women's University, Kolkata. Her area of research includes partition and refugee studies with special emphasis on eastern/northeastern India and Bangladesh. Her first monograph has been published by Routledge titled Refugee Borders and Identities, Rights and Habitat in East and Northeast India. And her second book is forthcoming titled Revisiting Partition, Contestation, Narratives and Memories, edited volume, Primus 2022. Our second speaker is Professor Vinod Kadriya, an acclaimed academic, author, editor, and former professor of economics and education at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. Professor Vinod Kadriya is renowned for his works on international migration and diaspora studies. His first book, The Migration of Knowledge Workers, staged 1999, based on extensive field surveys in India and the US under the Time of India Award 1992 and a Senior Fulbright American Fellowship 1995, had brought in a paradigm shift in the discourses on brain drain. He is the co-editor of World Migration Report 2020, the biennial flagship of IOM UN Migration. Recently, Professor Khadria has been elected as the president of Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, GRFDT, a think tank and a consortium of researchers and policymakers from across the world. Our third speaker is Professor Anjali Injuti. Professor Anjali Injuti is a former attorney, award-winning journalist, and author based near Atlanta. Her critically acclaimed books, Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and The Parted Earth were released in 2021. Her other work has appeared in the Oxford American, Harper's Bazaar, USA Today, Washington Post, and elsewhere. A former board member of the National Book Critics Circle, she teaches in the MFA program at Reinhardt University. Our fourth and final speaker for today is Professor Pippa Verde. Professor Pippa Verde is reader in South Asian history at De Montfort University and visiting fellow at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies. Her books include Pakistan, A Very Short Introduction, OUP 2021, From the Ashes of the 1947, Reimagining Punjab 2018, Coming to Coventry, Stories from the South Asian Pioneers 2006, and is co-editor of Refugees at the End of Empire, Imperial Collapse and Forced Migration in the 20th Century 2011. I would now like to invite Professor Aninditha Koshal to present her views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I'm actually very grateful to all of you for providing me with the opportunity to speak in this particular platform and with some very special guests. So I'm just so excited to share my research with all of them and learn from them. So I'm extremely grateful to this platform for providing me this opportunity. Thank you so much. Since I worked on partition and refugee issues, and as you have rightly mentioned that my key area of interest is Bengali refugees, I worked on the Bengal. So let me first tell you that as we all know that in this particular year, this year is very important as in this particular year, India and Pakistan is going to celebrate the 75th years of partition. At the beginning, if I should mention it, that in the beginning it was actually the term independence, not partition. So if we read all the materials available, which actually got published in 1950s and even in 1960s, the author and if we read the memoirs, the authors, they hesitated to use the term partition. They felt comfortable to use the term independence. And it is so strange that if we think of the popular imagery of partition, the most important imagery which comes in our mind is the lecture of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Tryst with Destiny lecture. And if we think about Pakistan, so Muhammad Ali Jinnah also spoke like in similar lines, and they actually kind of tried to assure the people that both these nation states, which were very new in the map of South Asia, they are going to maintain a kind of sovereignty and like right for people or everyone. But if we read the partition proceedings, which is available in Tinmurti Bhavan, anyone can read it. So if we read that carefully, it is so strange that it is mentioned there that what is there in the Radcliffe line and what happened at that point of time. But it is so strange that no one actually mentioned about the refugees in that way. So it was just written like there were the first mention of the term refugees, and it was mentioned that both the nation state will take care of these uprooted populace. But just what happened after that, it was actually it was very strange from the perspective of both the nations, both India and Pakistan. As we know that after both these nations, they got separated in 1947, there were actually not proper policies for the uprooted populace. And since I am talking about the Bengalis, Bengali refugees, it was actually I should mention here that the Bengali refugees, like the Hindus, they migrated from East Bengal. At that point of time, they have started using the word East Pakistan. Though the Pakistani constitute, they actually officially started use this word East Pakistan after they introduced the constitution in 1956. But from that land, these Hindus actually started migrating to West Bengal, Assam and Tripura, as it was their idea that that is the greater Bengal, and they chose places in which they are comfortable. They used to have their neighbors or some kind of friends. And the Muslim refugees from obviously from this particular region, the Bengali Muslims and some Bihari Muslims who tried to check with their luck from Bihar, they started migrating to that land. So if we remember like the rules and regulations of partition, what is important that it was actually based on the idea of majority and minority population. And all these refugees, Hindu refugees and Muslim refugees, they were under the impression that if they can cross the borderland, the notional border of or Bengal borderland, in the other side of the border, they will be able to are part of the majority community. So the idea was that the place of their origin, they perceived these themselves as minorities, and they thought if they can cross the borderland, they will be a part of the majority community. But it was actually unfortunate that in most of the cases, these refugees, their illusion was that their brethren will take them, and the nation state will give them some kind of relief and rehabilitation or some kind of property right. But it actually didn't happen in that way. Number one. Number two point is that as we all know, that there were some international mandate after the Second World War, but both India and Pakistan, they chose not to sign in those mandates. In case of India, Jawaharlal Nehru was scared that if he signs in the Convention of 1951 or the 1967 protocol, so he thought probably India at that point of time, it was a very it was a country which was just taking shape. So probably he thought that it will be difficult for India to abide by all these international mandates. So he decided to tackle these refugees, like the how to deal with these refugees and huge refugees locally or like as per the government. So now what India is facing, actually because of that India doesn't have any particular policy for the refugees. In India, if we read the partition historiography properly, the first trace was on the Punjabi refugees, not on the Bengali refugees. And Jawaharlal Nehru strangely was under the idea that the people are migrating from Bengal borderland, but probably they will go back after the riot days. But it didn't happen. In Bengal side, actually, migration was in different waves, and the refugees, they actually suffered a lot because of the absence of the proper government policies or something like that. And since this presentation is on identities, I wish to mention here that first, like the way I have mentioned, that India started like treating these refugees locally, like as per the government rule. Everything was depend upon that how the central government, who is in power, which political party, and how they will deal with that. Simultaneously, it is actually very strange that first they try to like ignore that idea that they are the refugees. So first they try to categorize them as displaced persons. If we read the primary sources available in the National Archives or everywhere, so first they term them as displaced persons, later they started saying them as evacuees, but they refuse to use this word refugees, so that these people, they don't try to claim all these things. And from 1960s they started like treating them as illegal migrants or illegal aliens. And even if we read the newspapers or the IB records carefully, so we'll be able to see that from 1970s, like this, they actually started treating these refugees as fugitives, as Pakistanis. So the idea of refugees, like if we read the primary sources carefully, and if we read the clauses of India Mujib Pact of 1972 carefully, so it was written there that the cutoff date is 24th March 1971, and before that, like whoever migrated to and fro this Bengal borderland, the nation state should treat them as citizen refugees, and after that, who have migrated, so they can treat them as like illegal migrants. But it was actually very unfortunate on the refugees part that they never actually got same kind of treatment. Number one. Number two, if we see the Bengal story, it is very strange that since the migration was on different waves, so in late 1940s or early 1950s, most of the refugees who have migrated as refugees, they were of different class. They were from upper classes or they were from upper middle class, who used to have some kind of cultural capital, so they could grab a job or they could settle down, like by support of some friends or neighbors or something like that. But the real refugees were who migrated from after 1964, after the riot of 1964. But the treatment of the nation state was actually always very like fluctuating, and like if we read the note sheets of the government, so we'll be able to see it properly. So my last point is I want to tell you that how these people who actually thought that if they can cross the Bengal borderland, if they can settle down anywhere in India, so they will get a better treatment. In Bengal, in West Bengal, we know that this term Bangali is very popular. So they actually always like got a strange feeling that uh, though they were Hindus, but they are not from West Bengal, so they are not from like the mainstream kind of populace. In Assam, it was more strange, as they started treating them as Bengal. As we know that there is a huge like political issues about the refugees there, and they started like first they termed them as Bhagonia, then they started like treating them as someone like who migrated kind of illegally, and from 1970s like they started terming them as Bohiragato and then Bideshi. In Tripura, it's more strange, as the tribal inhabitants who were the like domiciles of that land, they were so scared about this land grabbing populace like Bengali populace. They started like terming them as Wangsa. So they used to say Wangsa Faika, Wangsa Faika. It means it's Kokborok. It means that they should be very careful about the Bengalis. So Bengalis are so strange. So if we look at the other side of the Bengal borderland, the situation was similar. As in Bangladesh, like today's Bangladesh, then Bengal, East Pakistan, the popular term was Rifu or Refu. And also these refugees like who migrated, the Bengali Muslims who migrated from this land to that land, the another popular term is, as we all know, Mohajir. In Bangla, they term them as Mohajir or Mohajirin. And I wish to actually, there were another category, the Biharis. So the state started like treating them differently in a better way, as there were some linguistic similarity with the West Pakistanis, since they were in kind of in power there. So they were also a kind of a thing in Pakistan, and the war sufferers were the tribals, as during partition it was not the land which got divided, also the rivers and the hills. But if we read all these rules and regulations of partition, it was written for the Hindus or Muslims, but nothing was there for the tribals. So if we look at the position of the Chakmas or the Hajong tribes from Chittagong hill tract, or like tribals from Tripura, Mizoram, these lands also got like divided, but nothing was there from them for them. So they actually were the worst sufferers because of partition, but still like no one actually mentions about them. So my point is, what I try to mention here is that actually the feeling of otherness was there in both the lands, here like in India, this side of Bengal and that side of Bengal. And both the societies, like they actually treated them as encroachers or someone from the another land, and they remained like as others in that society also. Probably some of the families, they got benefited by their education or by the state policies, but in most of the cases, if we term our populace as refugees, who were the downtrodden people, who were the caste refugees, and who were from the lower class, so they actually suffered immensely in both the Bengal borderlands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very insightful presentation. I would now like to request Professor Vinod Kadriya to present his views on today's topic.
Well, certainly I join all the panelists in conveying our thanks for organizing this talk on a very interesting and important subject of identity crisis and identity reconstruction as a consequence of migration, which was directly related with partition. So I think it's a very narrow, specific subject that we want the stories about. And I think Anindita's presentation has provided very deep, understanding of the subject in the eastern part of India, eastern and northeastern part of India, and particularly the tribal identity has been submerged by the Bengali and Assamese and so on. So I will not go into the details of that, but I would like to widen the horizons of this particular discourse in the sense that 1947 was a very important year in world history, and particularly in the context of migration. What other partitions happened around that time? And partitions can be because of independence. Partitions can be because of secession from the country, one country from another country. Bangladesh, for example, seceded from Pakistan. India got independence from the British, India, Pakistan. But 1947, there was a very landmark partition of Palestine and Israel. Why I'm saying this? Because Israel, the Jews are at the center of discussion whenever we discuss about identity in migration. The diaspora, the word diaspora itself, the people without the homeland. is referring to Jews to begin with. Now it has become a much more generic term to, to indicate people who are from another country or even another state within a country. So it has become much more generic in that sense. So partition, if we look at partition from this generic categories, we have the example of Germany. Germany was divided between East and West Germany, and then reunification. That also leads to migration. And similarly, we have Korea, South Korea, North Korea, Vietnam. So we do have the Russian Federation has created so many countries out of the USSR, and so we need to look at situate the Indian partition in that context and see how it affects the migration of people on both sides of the borders, and then how it affects their identity. I think Anindita has rightly mentioned about the various terminologies that are being used for foreigners in terms of Bohiragato and the refugees. The refugee word actually in the Northeast is a derogatory term being used for the Bangladeshi Muslims. They would put another adjective and say Mia refugees. Mia is actually a Urdu term to indicate gentleman, but it is not used in that sense. It is used as somebody who is a parasite in the system. So we can go on at looking at the legal connotations of identity through migration, but there is a counterpart in terms of the social identity, that how people accept foreigners, the others, which are not like me. That I think is extremely important to take into account. If we do that, and if we look at how identity formation takes place, India, for example, at that point in time, 1947, a large number of Indians and maybe some Pakistanis also had left the country. They went to other parts of the world, and they, in fact, if we go into the history of India's independence, the independence movement led by Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and so on, was also, there was another side, for example, the simmering of these movements in other parts of the world. The Gadar movement, for example, in the United States, is very little known about it, was supported by the students, Indian students who were studying in the United States at that point in time, like the son of the Maharaja of Baroda, or Rabindranath Tagore's son was also part of that, population, small population of Indian students who were actually working towards India's independence. And that's where it was a pan-Indian identity. There was no talk about India-Pakistan at that point in time. It was actually, I would say, it was not Jinnah or Gandhi who created India and Pakistan. It was the British who created that. It was their policy of divide and rule that separated, that split not only India-Pakistan, but the whole of Indian subcontinent, whether it is Afghanistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Burma. All these are actually a creation of the British rule. When they leave the colonies, then they would like that these colonies get splitted into different smaller parts and, are always at each other's throat. So that, I think, is a perspective which creates the migration, because people are actually bound to the land and their relatives and friends and so on. And that is where you find that the migration streams take place on both sides. Anindita mentioned, in fact, see, the India-Pakistan migration at the time of partition is still the world history's largest movement of population, 11 million population, roughly, I think, 5 point something million from India, 6, and the Hindus came back to India from Pakistan, and 7 point some million when Muslims went from India to Pakistan. And similarly, in 1971, when Bangladesh was created, 10 million Bangladeshis came to Bengal and northeastern states. So they have on both sides, their families are split. We we hear stories about North and South Korea. Wherever there is ease of any tension between the two countries, then we find that the brothers are shaking hands from across the borders. And similarly in Vietnam. And Germany, of course, reunification had taken place. So we find that it's one single German identity that is still prevailing. So we need to look at the issue of identity crisis at the time of partition, and then reconstruction, which is a different process. Uh, I was referring to Nehru's visit to United States or after independence, because there were very few Indians in the United States, which today is the final destination for all migrants. About 100 Indians were there in the population, and those were the highly educated people. And it was only why Nehru went there. Nehru went there to bring back the highly qualified Indians to the Indian for the development of the country. But on the other hand, what happened was that large number of Indians started going to the United States after that. In fact, the IITs were set up. Today, IIT is the identity, the identity formation. IITian, nobody knows about JNUites or Jadavpur University's graduates or others, but you say IIT, everybody knows around the world. That happened because the IITs were set up in the 1960s as a strategy of the second 5-year plan's industrialization. Mahalanobis model was adopted that India would proceed on heavy industry. And for that, India needed engineers. And that's why 6 IITs were set up with foreign collaboration. And by the time the graduates came out on the market, on the job market, there were no jobs. So what happened? They all left. They left to NASA. NASA, there was Sputnik race between United States and Soviet Russia. And so the NASA lapped them up. The IITians, they were the best and the brightest, and topped it up with more education, made them into, the engineers were made into space scientists. And that's why it all began. And today we see that IIT identity starts right from the primary school. Families in India start preparing for admission of their children in IITs. There are so many coaching centers and coaching cities that have been created. But why? To get that identity of being an IITian and then go to the golden door of the United States. So this is all connected with migration. And we have to look also in terms of inward. Within the country, we have subnational identities. Anindita mentioned about Biharis and so on. These are some of the connotations which we find that the sons of the soil, and that, Myron Werner's book is titled by that name, Sons of the Soil. We are divided based on language, on education, on other cultural aspects. We have been divided. The reorganization of the states that took place was a big mistake, that we are a divided lot today based on language and culture. So this is where we find that the internal migration also has been an issue. Today, you find that the Maratha Manus one is talked about. We have a panelist from Bombay. She can tell us more about it. Or we find that in the COVID times, we find that states like Haryana are coming up with policies that 75% of the jobs should be reserved for the local people. So these enmities are also creating patterns of migration whereby people tend to go back to their roots and feel safe rather than being in an alien space, which can be within the country or outside the country. So I call them hubs and hinterlands of migration. The hubs are the destinations, and hinterlands are the countries or sources of origin that we do have. So we actually, if we look at these issues, then there are many other things that one can actually go on looking at. We can look at new states being created in India, Chhattisgarh and all the Jharkhand and Uttaranchal and so on. And all this we find are crucially important because the identity, the two sides of the identity, the legal identity and social identity created by migration streams go a long way. Today, we find why NRC, National Register of Citizens in the Northeast, created a problem. 4 million people could not be listed in that. Those registers at that time, enumeration was wrong, and the Supreme Court intervened to say that, well, they would lose their identity. And even ministers and indigenous people who have been residents there for a long time did not have those papers of legacy of that their parents and grandparents were residents of that place, because they did not have those papers. On the other hand, the foreigners from across the border who forged these documents, they created those identities. So they had the claim to all the rights, the citizens' rights, but these actual citizens did not have because of the identity problem. So that is what I think is something that we need to take into account. And I was, trying to put some thought to it, that what is an identity? OCI, Overseas Citizenship of India, was created as a, you see, in fact, Nehru's policy of non-aligned movement had distanced the Indian diaspora, because that was, Nehru had thought that would be intervention into internal affairs of other countries. And that's why the diaspora got disappointed that even after independence, India did not take up their interest in Caribbean, in Fiji and other countries. But it was the Janta government in 1977 that reversed that trend and started shaking hands with the Indian diaspora. And then we had the Indian ministry later on. In the later turn of the century, we had a new ministry under the new government called it was called Overseas Indian Affairs. And that is when the Singhvi committee's report, high-level committee on Indian diaspora, suggested that India should celebrate the diaspora and start celebrating the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas. Who were these people? 32 million. If you count all the people, non-resident Indians, as well as those who have taken up the citizenship of other countries. Otherwise, by the UN count, they are only 18 million, because they are the people who are still Indian, holders of Indian passport. So if we look at the statistics, that tells us the extent. India is actually, by the way, is the largest diaspora in the world. So we need to take this into account and find out what are the ways in which we are creating these identities and then destroying them, and reconstruction. Citizenship Amendment Act had created havoc in the country. That also needs to be taken into account. It was actually COVID-19 which had put a blanket on all these agitations. That's why the fire that was simmering there under the Citizenship Amendment Act was put off by the COVID, and we are into another kind of identity crisis or identity reconstruction, where we see how migration has come to a total halt. Travel has been, the main casualty of COVID-19, and we are now talking about new normal. And that new normal has its own identity issues. Who is going to be allowed to migrate and who not? Maybe the health professionals would be allowed special access, and others will have to prove themselves for migrating and settling down or coming back to the countries concerned. So I think it's a very fluid situation in terms of identity crisis and identity reconstruction, which is connected with migration. It all starts with partition, but partition is not one-time thing. It actually has after effects which continues. In fact, this displacement of Indians and Pakistanis exchange had taken place over 2 decades, from 1946. Actually, it started before independence up to 1965. And India was still deciding who will be the Indian citizens, what parts of the territories of the Greater Bengal, what parts on the western side would belong to India and Pakistan, and so on. So these negotiations were never ending, and I think we are going to have more new developments in the post-COVID era. We can go on talking about this. I'm sorry I've taken more than 7 minutes, but I think it is a big subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very informative. I would now request Professor Anjali Injuti to present her views on today's topic.
Thank you so much, Tishya. Thank you to everyone at the Global South Colloquium and my esteemed panelists here. Professor Kadriya actually gave me, unknowingly, the perfect lead-in to the topic that I would like to talk to very briefly today, which begins with the idea that independence and partition was not a one-time event in a fixed amount of time, but actually we see the very real present day consequences of it in identity and identity reconstruction. What do we mean by identity? What is the basis for one's identity? Certainly we are talking about who we are, where we come from, and who we belong to, meaning what our communities are. And when we talk about a crisis of identity, we are often talking about the result of not knowing fully who we are or where we come from and who our communities are. This opportunity, though, that we have is to reconstruct an ancestral history. And reconstructing this ancestral history can be the key to unlocking and better understanding our identities. And it is this that I would like to focus on for a few minutes, which is archives and the importance of archives. And how these archives can, in fact, ameliorate any identity crises involving migration, involving forced migration. Here's what we know, very generally speaking, which is that survivors of independence, of partition, when they were still alive, many of them were too traumatized to share their individual stories of what they endured with family members or friends. They were also very busy with what they had to do at hand, which was establish a new home in a new community that would have had a different language, a different culture. We know, too, that many of these forced migrants did not necessarily have the resources to establish a new home and a new foundation in a new country. When I began researching partition in the 1990s, one of the aspects of it that struck me most was how difficult it was to find first-hand testimonies from survivors about partition. Certainly, there were many primary resources where there would be information, a few sentences here, a few sentences there about where someone was migrating from, where they were going to, a little bit about what they endured. But the difficulty I found was looking for some kind of a collection somewhere, a warehouse, so to speak, of stories, a library that compiled stories of a particular region and made them available and accessible to the public. And this is what I became most interested in. We can, certainly soon after partition, we had books, we had articles, we had photographs, but it was the sort of the biographies of the people who lived through independence that wasn't as widespread available to many people, and wasn't necessarily being collected at that time, given that the political upheaval of partition was ongoing for quite some time. Just to give a little bit of a global context here, the Hiroshima Peace Museum was built in the 1950s, only 10 years after the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb. We have archives about the Holocaust and World War II, for example, that were established 30, 40, 50 years. But formal, centralized, comprehensive archives did not happen in the subcontinent for quite some time, most of them not until this century, the 21st century. There are many reasons for this that I'm not going to take the time to go into now, but what I want to talk briefly about is the result, which is catastrophic when we talk about identity, right? Our familial, communal histories are very much the basis for identities. And if we do not know them, this is the basis for a crisis of identity. We have lost, because so much time has passed, millions of firsthand accounts from people who survived partition. And the descendants of partition, of which there are millions more, do not know their complete family histories, their cultural histories. So for many descendants, particularly those that end up in the diaspora, who are not even physically connected to the land anymore, partition is something that is like a shadow for them. They know it's there. They know the history. They can see the outline of this history in their identities. However, they don't know the full story of their family members about what happened. And this lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, this lack of inheritance, if you will, of not knowing what happened to their family, because there were not opportunities at the time to share these stories, has shaped their identities, this lack of knowledge. As I mentioned, certainly the 21st century has done a lot of catching up to the lack of archives. We have books, certainly Urvashi Bhutalia's seminal book, The Other Side of Silence, which was published in 2000. In 2007, we have the Oral History Project of the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. They began collecting stories. Ashish Nandi and Rajmohan Gandhi's Partition Project, which was at the India Center for the Study of Developing Societies, was also started about this time. And we have the 1947 Partition Archive, which began in 2010. So there are places now there are hubs, if you will, that are collecting these stories. Of course, we don't have as many survivors alive today as once did, but they exist, and this history. Because it is a history, because partition is not simply a history of the subcontinent. It really is a global history and should be thought of that way. And as Professor Kadriya mentioned, we have partitions happening all over the world in the past and in the present day. But it is a reckoning that they are active, that we now have trained historians who are still continuing to collect these stories. And that there is now a place for those who are survivors, who are still alive, but also their immediate descendants to take their families' prime sources, any archives, to help tell the story. Our archives always have been and always will be such a vital part to a person's identity, and I'm grateful now that we have incredible archivists out there who are doing the work that unfortunately took too long to get off the ground, but now have provided vibrant resources and documentations that later generations can now look to and understand some of their histories. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a brilliant presentation. I would now like to request Professor Pippa Verde to present her views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, thank you. And again, I would like to echo what's been said. Thank you for the invitation, and great to be in this panel and to make a contribution to it. I suppose I had made some notes about what I was going to talk about, but then sort of having listened to the three previous speakers, I think it's immediately, made me think so much more about some of the other things that I've also been working on. I suppose my kind of the points that I was going to make were really structured around three main issues. Well, actually, four main issues. One was thinking about the movement of people. Two was thinking about how the porous border turns into a hard border. So I guess this is really coming from my own sort of research and having spent time across the border between India and Pakistan in Punjab, and thinking quite sort of perhaps in a slightly different way, thinking about how the border has an impact on people's lives on the ground. And in that sense, I suppose, when Anjali just now was talking about thinking about partition and refugees in a kind of global history perspective, I was immediately kind of thinking about really how this plays out on the ground, in these places. So, one, movement of people, two, thinking about the shift from the porous to the hard border, and thirdly, thinking about the kind of demographic and cultural and social transformation of spaces, and thinking specifically actually about the physical spaces, about the city spaces, about the towns, the villages. So a way, in a sense, not just thinking about the people, but the ways in which those physical spaces also then have an impact on people and their sense of self. And then finally, kind of really thinking about increasingly, I suppose, in a kind of post-partition, post-independence space, thinking about more communalized identities and therefore also then of the minority status, within the subcontinent. And so I think, these four areas were really the kind of ways in which I was going to kind of talk about this. And I suppose the starting point is to kind of think about, really, when we think about the movement of people, is to what extent the leaders at the time, they really didn't give much consideration to the movement of people. And that's partly because actually they weren't expecting this mass migration to take place. So when we talk about this kind of largest migration in the 20th century happening, it's because they didn't think actually this would happen, that people would physically get up from their houses and migrate. And the reason, of course, what this starts to happen is because it's the sheer level of violence that's taking place. So, even though the signs actually of violence were there. So when we think about violence in the subcontinent, this is not a kind of a new phenomenon. It's been there in the 19th century. We also know when we look at Mukhali, we look at Bihar, we look at Rawalpindi in March 47, the signs were there that, the level of violence is escalating, and therefore this is also leading to people getting up and leaving and being forced to leave. So the fact is that, they still didn't anticipate this happening. And of course, the other thing is, interestingly, although you have these two countries being established in August 47, even people like Jinnah was still talking about envisaging a Pakistan with minorities. And of course, India was established as a secular country. So this idea that you can have two independent countries, but with minority populations, I think this is something that, they expected. But how do we now accommodate these minorities? And I think this, of course, is, increasingly becoming problematic in contemporary discourse. And we've seen lots of sort of discussions, and Binod has, talked quite a lot about this earlier on. So I think, that is one, thinking about that shift of people. The other thing, related to that point, was actually some people didn't want to move. There are lots of accounts in the documents about, and one of the places that I've looked at, Lalpur, which had a sizable non-Muslim population. they refused to go. In the end, they had to leave. Francis Modi, he was talking about the West Punjab governor. He was telling them, you have to move because it's not safe now for you to stay. The other thing about actually, related to that is, unless those people move, then you can't have those incoming populations being able to live, because where are those people going to be accommodated in those physical spaces? So I think this is a really kind of complicated issue, and it's certainly, in terms of how it works on the ground, it varies from place to place. There's a lot of kind of local tension, but there's obviously a lot of, domino effects taking place as well. I suppose in terms of thinking about the border as well, and like to reference Wazir Zamandar's 2007 work here in the Long Partition about, how actually in the early years that border was quite fluid. And there was much more flexibility in terms of movement of people, coming back and forth. There were, some people obviously were still, if we think about the kind of families, certainly I've spent time with people in Malayakotla whose families were split between India and Pakistan. But when it came to marriages or special occasions, there was still quite a lot of interaction. And this interaction really starts to disappear around the mid-1960s. So until then, you still have a much more kind of flexible, porous border, and there's new work now beginning to emerge, also on the Punjab borderland. We know of the Bengal borderland and how the movement of people lingered on for a much longer period, and of course culminates in 1971 in many ways. So there's but even on the kind of Punjab borderland, you still have this very kind of porous border in the early periods. The other is kind of thinking, I'm kind of going to rush through some of these things because I want to pick up some of the other points that were being made, is thinking about the impact of the demographic changes that have taken place as a consequence of those populations, huge numbers of people, who are forced to leave. And how does that have an impact then on the physical landscape of what becomes India and Pakistan? And specifically then also thinking about cities like Delhi, for example, which has a very different identity, prior to independence. And how it's reimagined with the huge number of Punjabi refugees coming into Delhi, and kind of thinking about now, what is the language of Delhi? What is the food cuisine of Delhi? What is the culture of a place like Delhi? And equally, you have these same sort of questions also happening in places like Lahore, which has this, huge, influence of Hindus and Sikhs prior to 47. And of course, it was the capital of the Sikh Empire as well, under Ranjit Singh. So how do these cities now, reimagine themselves in a kind of a new milieu? And, how do we remember these places, particularly sort of when we think about them today? I, of course, have kind of spent a lot of time in smaller cities and thinking about the wider implications of, this population transfer on the smaller cities like Ludhiana, like Lalpur, both of which actually had, a majority other population, and then you kind of think about this kind of total out migration of the other community. How does that city now, rebuild itself, reconstruct itself? What language does it speak? I mean, within Punjab, it's not so sort of, difficult, because if you all speak Punjabi, then in a sense, you're speaking the same language. But even just to give you a small sort of an example, is in Lalpur, the kind of dialect of Punjabi that's spoken, is actually from the kind of Punjabi that's spoken in Ludhiana, in the Doaba, and you can immediately sort of catch those kind of phrases, those words, which would sort of locate you in a kind of pre-47 era, and so people know they know that these were people who migrated or have their ancestors from the other side. So it's really kind of interesting, even when we think about the language. But I suppose, in a sense, the spaces, I suppose, in terms of thinking about these communalized identities, is how we can think about, I suppose, sorry, I'm kind of thinking out aloud, is I think that kind of lack of a cross-border history, is really sort of lacking here in terms of trying to kind of think about how we can work across borders. Now, these don't necessarily have to be geographical borders or territorial borders, but thinking about even religious, even caste, region, and and some of these points have been discussed, by the other panelist here. But how can we kind of work across these kind of different kinds of boundaries to kind of have a more or a better understanding of the other? And because we haven't been doing this, I think there's a real sort of vacuum here in the kind of literature. I'm kind of very lucky. I always say that I'm very lucky and fortunate that I've been able to, I suppose, because I do belong to that diaspora, I'm able to travel between that hard border, and so experience how this has had an impact on identities on both sides. And I think these are sort of very sort of important questions, especially sort of 75 years on now, considering where we are in terms of thinking about India and Pakistan, especially in terms of their the way they go forward. And I think here I would just like to sort of just pick up on a couple of things that have been mentioned by some of the other speakers, especially Binod and Anjali, is thinking about the role of the diaspora and the role of the diaspora in making of that refugee identity. And this is something that I've been trying to kind of really understand and wrestle with myself. And this is because I think the diaspora has a particular lens. We've talked about how some people migrated away from India, Pakistan, and settled abroad. And of course, if you live here in the West, then you're very much kind of exposed to the history of the Holocaust and genocide studies, because this is widely taught in these countries. And I think the interesting thing for me is how we imagine or how we understand and write about the history of partition, whether do we write it within a kind of broader subcontinental history, or do we understand it from this kind of new sort of global history in terms of thinking about it, borrowing the language of the Holocaust in many ways. So when we talk about survivors, the term survivor itself, it's something that's applied to the Holocaust, but it's increasingly applied to understanding partition victims as well. So to what extent has the study of the Holocaust had an impact on how we understand partition? And I'd like to just kind of, I suppose, say something which is really sort of more as a point of discussion, is that to what extent has partition become more of a concern for the diaspora, and therefore the diaspora identity crisis, rather than for the subcontinent? is there something within this which is about this kind of lack of rootedness of the diaspora and the places that they live in, that, you know, the partition offers a way of kind of connecting to their past? I realize these are kind of, in many ways, it's to really kind of provoke a kind of a conversation and a discussion, because I think much of the new work on partition is coming from the diaspora and from the West. So therefore, I have to also then ask that question of what's happening over in the subcontinent. How do they read these histories and these ideas? And I think, that, do we sort of have different lenses when we sort of talk about these issues when we're in Punjab, when we're in Bengal, or whether we're sitting here in the diaspora? And therefore, to what extent does that sort of have an impact on the kind of identity formation? So these are really kind of points for discussion rather than, I thank you in advance for allowing me to kind of indulge in some of these. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very enlightening. So with this, we now move on to the question-answer round of today's segment. So my first question is for Professor Aninditha Koshal. Sometimes forced migrants replace or conceal their ethnic or refugee identity in order to escape distressing situations. Could you tell us about some of the advantages and disadvantages of situational embracing or rejecting of identities?
Thank you so much for this question. Thanks to all these panelists. I learned so much from all of you. To answer this question, I should mention here about a case study. Maybe I can mention here about the Chakma refugees who got settled down in Arunachal Pradesh. Probably they will be the right person to give an example of this kind of cases. So if we read like the history of Pakistan in 1960s, so it was actually the building of the Kaptai dam. So because of that, these Chakma refugees, they had to migrate from that land to here. And at that point of time, they were okay with the idea that they can leave their kind of identities, their kind of cultures, and their kind of linguistic identities or kind of things, just to settle down somewhere for their life, habitat, and to just for their livelihood. So they got settled down by the government of India in Arunachal Pradesh. At that point of time, it was termed as NEFA. But what happened after that, if we look at these refugees today, like in 2022, so they are still their stateless persons. They are not refugees even. So we can understand that at that point of time, they were ready to give up their identities and they were okay with their refugee identities as they thought they could save their lives and they will be able to settle down at least somewhere with land. And it was like their search for a different kind of homes. So this identity, actually, they were okay with the imposition of this kind of identities, but they thought that they will get benefited with the idea of citizenship, which introduced by the government of India in 1955. Some of them actually got citizenship, like some ration cards and everything, some identity cards, but most of them, they're still stateless persons. So it is a wonderful example, I believe, that how we can actually understand this migration, that why these people have migrated and what was their expectation and why they were agreed to give up their identity, and they actually were fine with their kind of new identities. But after migration for several decades, and most of these people are actually, now they were born in India, but they don't have a citizenship right. And now these like Arunachali people, they are saying that go back refugees and we don't want here in this land. So this is probably the right example to define that how a single community, they actually suffered. They first thought that will be of their help, and probably after that they have realized that now they are no one as they are stateless people. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And my second question to you is, could you tell us how new communities and identities are formed due to partition with reference to your new book, Revisiting Partition? Could you also tell us about the way in which the reception systems or techniques of the host country play a crucial role in the identity reconstruction of a refugee?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, in this particular book, in my first book, I tried to write about the only about the Bengali refugees who got settled down in West Bengal, Assam, and Tripura. And I wrote a little bit about East Bengal, not East Pakistan, East Bengal, just to like show that how the composite culture was different and what was the actual reason behind this communal politics and something like that. So that was my point. But in this particular book, in this new book, I actually tried to widen my horizon, and I tried to incorporate East Bengal, East Pakistan, Bangladesh a little bit here. And in this book, I particularly tried to incorporate things which like did not get addressed by the social scientists, the historians, or the political scientists. And I try to incorporate many other aspects like which are very important, as my co-panelists they were also mentioning about. So I try to incorporate different kind of sources, like, and I try to use like films and like novels and lots of memoirs and lots of oral narratives here. And to me the deception was actually very very important, as if we look at the let me speak a little bit about the East Bengal side, East Pakistan side. We can feel that the reception was so different for the Bengali refugees and for the non-Bengali refugees, for the Biharis. But if we look at like from the state's perspective, if we look at the both on the both the communities, na, so most of the Bengalis, since they have migrated from these lands, so some of them were optees, like who opted for government services, so they were kind of educated and they could grab some kind of like land and like they had education, so some jobs, etc. But otherwise also the Bengali refugees, they were kind of educated, and the state they could have like treat them more nicely and maybe could treat them as a source of nation building, but it didn't happen. The stress was more on the Bihari refugees, as the linguistic similarities there, as we know that language is so important there, and who have migrated here. Like if we look at these states, even like Punjab side, so we can see that the linguistic familiarity was important there. And for reception, what I realized when I was working on all these states, actually we cannot categorize anything uniformly here. So it was the state politics and it was the state environment or the local people who were actually responsible, and also the local relief rehabilitation department. As if we see the policy making part, na, everything was like for Bengal and Punjab the policies were same, but the implementation part was different. So it was very much there in case of Bengal, both sides Bengal, and for the Punjabis it was kind of different, as it was a one-time flush, and the central government was kind of aware of their crisis and they tried to settle them down. So the reception was actually very different in all these geographical areas. That is my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So now we'll move on to Professor Binod Kadriya. My first question to you is, sir, do you think the immigration policy of the developed countries in general has a bearing on the living conditions of migrant community of the third world countries?
Well, obviously, yes. My answer would be yes, but these terminologies do not exist anymore. We don't call them third world country anymore. So they are global north and global south. That's the latest that we use. So yes, to recast your question, does it make a difference to the people from the global south? Now, there are two sides. One is home, the other is the host country, where the families are split, between two spaces. And so which living conditions are we talking about? That I think is extremely important. In terms of the developed countries you are talking about, so if we look at developed countries, they can be, identified as North America, the United States and Canada, Europe, mainly England and the continental Europe, Australia, New Zealand in the Pacific, and then Of course, newly developed countries like Singapore, Malaysia are also destinations. So these are the four main hubs of migrants, going there. And these are controlled, regulated by the immigration policies of these countries. In fact, migration itself has two sides, immigration and emigration. The emigration does not matter much because most countries are liberal democracies, and excepting for conscription, they do not control out migration. So it is the in migration which is controlled, and that is determined by the immigration policy. And that is where it's very, very complicated. It varies from country to country. Canada has its own point system. Similarly, Australia has point system. US has a completely different system. And then Europe always has been known as the fortress Europe, is different from its next door neighbor, the United Kingdom. Um, and you have heard about Brexit now. So that is something also entirely new. And then Singapore, Malaysia are, they are, particularly Singapore has lack of population, so they want workers there. And Malaysia has a diversified population, so that's very, very important. So if we look at the policies in a basket, then we find that these policies actually provide the pathways in terms of from temporary migrants who come and go, including students. And then there are the permanent residents, and then, all the pathway onto the citizenship, the naturalized citizenship. And then we cross that path further, then we are in the domain of dual citizenship, which is, still in the making. It's not multiple nationalities and so on. So these are impinging upon two ways in terms of their living conditions, in terms of their feel-good factor. What are their rights and what are their duties in terms of, what are their savings, how much they spend, what are their consumption levels. So all these are actually determined, governed or affected by the immigration policy as such. So I think this is a field by itself, which is being debated now under the Sustainable Development Goals, and then within the Global Compact for migration. Global Compact for migration is also something which is very, very determining in terms of migration governance, how what do's and don'ts and things like that. But there is no teeth. They are not binding on the countries. Countries have their own sovereignty issues. So I would stop at this because you have other questions, and perhaps, and we are running short of time. I can understand that you have two more questions. I would be happy to give brief answers.
Thank you, sir. My second question to you is, language is one of the main components of identity that contribute to the sense of belonging. How does language barrier in the host country lead to identity crisis, and what steps can be taken by the authorities to bridge this gap?
Excellent. Very interesting question. Very interesting question. It touches the heart of the migrants. Language is something that one uses for communication, and communication barriers can create havocs, can create problems. And we find that, my there used to be, starting from TOEFL, for example, for student migrating, they have to take the test for languages, but also workers have to, what the terminologies keep on changing, SEMLE or something. So you have to pass these tests, and if you pass this test, then you are eligible for getting the visas. So this is a very interesting story. If you go to Punjab, for example, Punjabis are a sub-nationality in India whose heart is in Canada. So you will find interesting. One of my students had done work on failed migration in Punjab. It can lead to suicides. It can lead to mental problems if you cannot go out. There are temples, visa temples. You have to do some offerings to get your visa, and so on. So there are very interesting stories for your organization. But if you look at how this is affecting, how the barriers are coming and going, see, we used to think in terms of assimilation. That was the terminology which was used. Assimilation means you assimilate with the host country culture and language completely, give up your own. And that is a no-no now. It is a politically incorrect language. That has been replaced by the terminology called integration. So the integration is from both sides. You accommodate the people who are coming from the other countries with other culture, with other language, and you reach out to them, create space for them, and don't impose your own culture, your own history, your own languages on them. It's easier said than done, but it is there. So I think it is important that which countries are doing. Australia, for example, has a very long tradition of multiculturalism, whereas some other countries perhaps would, try European countries, for example, but France, example, for example, if you speak in English, they will not even look at you if you go to the shops. And I had terrible time convincing the shopkeeper to give me what I wanted. So I played a trick. I started speaking in Hindi, and this lady started speaking in English to communicate with me. But till I was speaking English, she would not budge. She would just only speak French. So this is the human psychology. This is where we need to, the countries' policies need to integrate people rather than try to assimilate. That, I think, is the right path. The success may be 10%, 20%, but that should be good enough on language.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. So now we'll move on to Professor Anjali Injuti. So my first question is to you, ma'am. To what extent does stereotypical representation of refugees in media and films further aggravates the issue of identity crisis among refugees?
Great question, and sadly, it is to a great extent. All kinds of mainstream media have flattened the stories of forced migration. I'll focus on one method of doing this, which is that when we tell these stories, when we relay these stories, we are very often completely ignoring the systemic causes of forced migration. And this could be anything from climate change, it can be from economic instability, which leads to lack of work, a living wage, food, shelter, education, and of course, political upheaval. I will reference something Binod said earlier, which was about the role of the British when we were talking about partition. British colonization played a major role in partition. Partition essentially did not begin in the 20th century. It began a couple 100 years earlier with the East India Company. It began when the British Crown took over. And frequently stories about independence and partition completely ignore this major factor for the cause of the largest human migration in history, where up to 2 million people perished. And so this in and of itself becomes a tremendous flattening with refugees during partition. And we can look at this today, using examples today. For example, the complete flattening of forced migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border. As many people know, the United States, beginning in the 1980s, set about to completely destabilize Central America, particularly El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And this destabilization is what plays a significant role in the refugee crisis we are having at the U.S.-Mexico border. People are fleeing because of our coups, because we installed dictators, because we exported gang violence from the United States to Central America. And when we tell these stories about forced migration at the southern U.S. border, very rarely is this put in any kind of context, right? We talk about refugees as individuals who make these individual choices in silos. This is never the case. Forced migration doesn't come in a vacuum where one person or one family is dealing with violence, is dealing with a lack of food, and then therefore attempts to migrate, right? It is these systems of power that force migration. And so until we learn in the media to address these systemic causes, we will always continue to be telling stories, very flattened, very superficial, very decontextualized stories of refugees.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. We have two questions from the audience, which we'll be taking at the end of the session. So now we'll move on to the second question to Professor Anjali. That is, could you tell us about how migrating to a new country opens educational and employment opportunities for refugee women and hence contributes to their identity formation, which otherwise might not have been possible in the traditional homeland?
So this is an interesting question, Tishya, and I think I would like to address it by flipping it on its head and continuing the theme of the systems we have in place. We either have in place or don't have in place for refugees. So for example, we know that many refugee women in particular, end up stranded in refugee camps for many years before they have the opportunity to make it to a new country. We know that even when they do come to a new country, as Anindita mentioned, there are not necessarily resources to reestablish lives in the new country, right? Pippa mentioned this as well. There weren't necessarily homes for people who moved. There was not an expectation at partition that so many millions of people would traverse borders. And so, you know, the assumption that there are opportunities at all should actually be explored because for many circumstances, they are not established and they are not readily available for these refugees. We know, for example, that refugees get separated from their families, and that this is a predominant issue in their lives, which make it very difficult to take advantage of opportunities, even if there are opportunities. What we know is that forced migration is often it often must endure a lengthy and, for the most part, inefficient process for refugees. And despite the incredible people who do the work of resettlement, it often falls short for the sheer number of people who are becoming refugees at a given point in time, whether today or in history, if we talk about partition. There are not institutions necessarily established to handle the number of people that cross new borders. And so what happens is, as well, on the flip side of this coin, is that we have, even if there are opportunities for refugees, particularly women, the refugees are often exploited by them. They receive perhaps employment by employers who are abusive, by employers who do not give them proper wages and essentially put them in situations that are result in indentured servitude or enslavement. And of course, refugees who are still in the process of formally seeking asylum, who do not actually have their papers in hand yet because they're still working through a lengthy legal process, do not feel that they can report these abuses because they feel it might jeopardize their petitions for asylum, you know, wherever this occurs. Refugees are also faced by xenophobia, which can impact their opportunities for education and employment. You know, we can take a look at recent years all over the world, particularly in the United States and Europe, where there is this great increase of nationalism. I'm not sure, you know, there is a large cost to being a refugee that may in fact overshadow somewhat the educational and employment opportunities in these new countries. So I think it's important that when we think about opportunities, we think about the realities of the situations that refugees are entering. And we also need to keep in mind that refugees come to countries with education. It might not be a formal education, but it very certainly is a skill set of some kind. And so they, in fact, have a lot to offer. Now, I hesitate to even bring this up because I do not believe that we should think of refugees purely in a capitalistic context, as in they only have value if they can offer the new country some kind of skills or knowledge. I don't want to go down that road. But I think it is important to look at the big picture of what we think of as opportunities, especially as the receiving countries, and what the reality is for refugees on the ground who are stuck in these processes, who may, in fact, in the United States, you are initially incarcerated in many circumstances as a refugee. You are put into detention centers. So I think it's just important to see the entire context when we think about opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. So we'll now move on to Professor Pippa Verde. So my first question to you is, could you shed some light on the way partition has been represented in the history of India and Pakistan, and how the partition-related violence as part of the broader historical narrative of the time has a bearing on the Punjab experience?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the first part is kind of interesting, thinking about, the ways in which it's represented. I suppose in terms of thinking about partition is that, it has many meanings for many people. It's been written about in different ways and different perspectives, depending on, how you look at what partition means. And I think for someone who also spends a lot of time in Pakistan is, I think one also has to ask the question, does that partition have the same meaning for the Pakistanis as it does for Indians and Bangladeshis? Because, of course, independence in terms of what it entails has one meaning, but then at the same time, simultaneously, you also have a carving up of regions to create that homeland, whether that's homeland for the Muslims of British India, or whether that's a new independent homeland for Indians. So it has, I think, it has to be understood in different multiple ways. And in terms of the kind of thinking about the history, it depends really then who's writing that history. Are we talking about the kind of history textbooks of India? Are we talking about Pakistan? Or are we talking about even British history and in the ways in which, this same history is represented in this country? So the fact that it has many meanings actually then also tells you about what that means in itself. And of course, we know that recently it was a very kind of interesting, movement by the Indian Prime Minister Modi, how, in August, he talked about now commemorating that day as a remembrance partition horrors remembrance day. Now, how do we read this in terms of how the Indian state now wants to remember this moment in time? Because at the same time, then it also takes the emphasis away from other things, and so you kind of associate it with a particular type of history. So I think it's kind of interesting in the ways in which it's been used by different players, whether they're state players or non-state players. And here in the UK also, there was an attempt to remember 17th August, the day that, the Radcliffe Award was made public, to remember that as a partition commemoration day. And this is in the UK, right? So, what is the kind of message being conveyed here? That if you try to, it hasn't happened, but the point is that, in the ways in which we use the memory of partition and the ways in which it's become increasingly politicized. And I suppose, if we're thinking about then the Punjab and what it means for the Punjab, of course, for many Punjabis, but of course that population is also, decreasing, is that it's associated with a particular moment at a upheaval, a tremendous kind of shift in the ways in which we understand Punjab, not just kind of territorially, but in terms of thinking about our familial relations, the turmoil that people go through. It's a huge, it has a huge impact on Punjab and the Punjabi mindset. So for Punjab also then is that, do we talk about partition more than we talk about independence? Because actually the popular memory is of partition, not necessarily of that moment which also gives you independence.
Thank you, ma'am. My second question to you is, can you throw some light on how continuously living in the memories of the homeland and its culture poses hindrances in adjusting to the new environment post-partition and creating a new identity to move forward with?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Here, I guess I would like to say that I think, from my experience of, being in Punjab continuously now, on and off for 20 odd years plus, and actually being a Punjabi myself, is that I don't think they live in that, in the memories of the homeland. So the Punjabis, in the homeland, I don't think live in those memories. I think both countries are quite distinct now. It's been 75 years, and perhaps today are more their true selves than ever before. In many ways, we may not like what they are, but actually, I think, curiously, I think we are much truer to ourselves. We talk about, the British role in that kind of the whole divide and quit. And we like to talk and romanticize about this kind of nostalgic past when we were all brothers, bye-bye, ek saath, and, all that kind of stuff. But, why is it that the specter of communalism hasn't left us, right? So that also has a place in our understanding of who we are and the way we are. And we are part of that kind of creation. So in that way, I think, over there's a much more sort of lived reality and acceptance, perhaps kind of away from the homeland. And when you are away from the homeland, you see the homeland in a different way. And I think this is perhaps, where, I have that kind of perspective of sort of living in the diaspora and sort of, being around the diaspora and how they kind of view the homeland is perhaps different to the way the lived reality is in the homeland. And I think this has to be kind of much more complicated than it has until now.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thank you so much. So we have two questions from the audience. So if there is time, we can take those questions. So the first question is to Anindita ma'am. How would you correlate the issues of NRC and CAA with the migration-related issues?
Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, NRC, the issue of NRC and CAA is actually very integral. Both these things are actually very integral with the issues of migration. As we all know that NRC is extremely related with the idea of like citizenship and who, like it is like proclamation of the nation state that who belong to this land and who don't. It is important, and it's so important that in most of the cases, like NRC, when these people from Assam, they didn't find out their name in the list. In most of the cases, they used to have like all their documents. Probably something was missing from the 1951 census data or something like that. But what is important here, I can't talk so much about it. So, but what is important here is that what I was telling you, that people who used to have a proper citizenship card or a voting identity card or a ration card or something like that, when they migrated, they thought that if they can grab these piece of cards, plastic cards, they will be able to recreate their identity here in this land. But what happened in case of NRC and CAA, which is important, as CAA and NRC both, actually it has some kind of religious connotation too, which is problematic a bit from a nation state like India, which proclaims in a way that they maintain a different kind of ideology or something like that. But what is important here, what I was telling when I was speaking for the first session, so what I was trying to tell, that these people, these refugees who actually could grab their national identities or some cards, end of the day they realize that even if they have these kind of national identity cards, the state may question any time about their identity, and the state may decide that they can tell these people that no, you do not belong here. So I think it is integrally related with the idea of migration, with the idea of their refugeehood, and how they perceive themselves as refugees or as a refugee family here in this land. And in most of the cases, the idea of otherness was there for these families, which is unfortunate. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. This question is also open to the other panelists if anyone wants to answer.
Well, I can briefly make a comment on this, why this has been so, volatile. The NRC and CAA seems to be pitted against each other. Yes, the NRC is National Register of Citizens to prove their identity from 1951, as Anindita said, and those who have got their education until 1971, March 24th. This is a long history of the Assam agitation, Assam Accord, and all those things, and finally the intervention of the Supreme Court, which mandated this NRC. The CAA, as again Anindita said, has a religious clause in this, that the non-Muslim Hindus, 6 religious groups, Hindu, Jain, Parsis, and so on and so forth, from 3 neighboring countries. They, till 2014, if they have come to India for within 7 years of residency, illegal residency, they will be entitled to getting the citizenship. Now, the problem which came up in terms of in the minds of the people were that you can convert and reconvert. You can become, your religion can be changed for the purpose of getting that eligibility. And then once you have got it, you can change your religion again. So there are wheels within wheels in this, and this actually erupted into violence, a lot of violence. And so it's still a very, very, a hot issue on which I don't think there is an easy solution. Just to add.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Mr. Sukhdev Das, for this question. Now, I guess there is another question from Mr. Atanu Das. Was there any epidemic pandemic which influenced the lives of the refugees? My question is to Anindita, ma'am.
Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, since the refugees are like they belong to a group, like they are probably the margin of the margin. So the way we conceive the refugees as a marginal community. So for us, for like the normal residents or for the normal citizens of different countries, for us, this epidemic and pandemic situation, as we know that what we are experiencing for last 2 years almost. So I have actually written one article on this issue in Anandabazar Potrika in Bangla, that how these refugees all over the India, how they are suffering and what is the actual condition of the refugees all over the world. So I was reading about the Syrian refugee camps, and for like the normal citizens of different countries, we saw, especially in the second wave, that there were actually scarcity of hospitals, beds, oxygen cylinders, and many issues. So I was reading about the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. So their population density is so huge. So the government of Bangladesh were extremely scared about the fact that how to handle with this situation. And for the detention camps which is there in Assam, uh, what I read about these refugees, I don't know how to if we can categorize them as refugees right now, as the nation state is challenging their identities even, and they are saying that they are not Bangladeshis. So I'm not going into that. But what we saw about the refugees or the stateless people who are there in Assam, they were actually in detention camps, and the situation was, of course, very worrying. And also for the rest of the world, like in each and every country, as we know that the refugees are everywhere. So I have experienced something in when I was in France. So I tried to board a train, and someone came to me with a with a piece of paper, and he wrote that I am a refugee. Please help me. So I was shocked. So at times we feel like that the like first world countries or West, like the condition of the refugees are better there, but I'm not very sure about it. But of course, this pandemic and epidemic situation, it actually, I think the refugees and all other marginal communities, the stateless people who are not liable to get so much support from the nation state. Some refugee camps, like the residents of some refugee camps, they are fortunate as they can get some help from the UNHCR or some international bodies. But like people who are not like entitled to get that kind of help, probably their condition is worse. Thanks for this question.
Thank you, ma'am. This question is also open to the other panelists if they want to contribute their views.
Could I say something,
Yes.
Tishya? Just quickly, I think it was interesting, the question, because something that I'm also working on at the moment, which is actually specifically to do with women and looking at the role of women following the partition, and particularly looking at refugee camps and their role in the rehabilitation of refugees, but also taking on a much more caring role. So a lot of women were coming out because they were seen to be to fit into that kind of role of caring and looking after and nursing the refugees. So they were taking on these roles. But of course, the refugee camps in Punjab, many of them had epidemics, illnesses were right, and a lot of people which we don't know about died in the refugee camps rather than in the as a consequence of the violence. So it's I think a little bit more work now has been done on this area, and I think there's a scholar, Ilyas Chatta, has also written about the refugee camps and nursing. So we're beginning to see actually a much better understanding. And it's interesting now that with the COVID situation, how we now go back and look at these moments in a very different light. So it's very sort of educational for us as academics as well, I think.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Mr. Atanu Das, for this question. So I guess there are no more questions from the audience. So with this, we now come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much for joining us. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit our website. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Aninditha Koshal, Professor Vinod Kadriya, Professor Anjali Injuti, and Professor Pippa Verde for this truly remarkable session. It was wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.